In the history of the Oscars, only Bob Hope and Billy Crystal have emceed more often than the legendary Johnny Carson. Of course, Johnny Carson's true impact on pop culture came through hosting The Tonight Show for nearly 3 decades.
Johnny Carson was the king of late-night television, a charming, razor-sharp host who could make anyone laugh and keep millions entertained night after night. But behind that smooth smile and calm demeanor, not every guest was welcome. Some pushed his patience, others broke his trust, and a few just didn't click at all. From icons he quietly resented to stars he flat-out banned, these were the rare guests who got under Carson's skin. This isn't just gossip. This is the untold truth behind the strained smiles and silent feuds. These are the celebrities Johnny Carson truly hated having on his show. Bob Hope. Johnny Carson was a master of conversation. He could make just about anyone feel at ease. But when Bob Hope sat in the guest chair, the room felt different. With Hope, it wasn't a conversation, it was a performance, Carson once said off-camera. Despite being 2 of the biggest names in comedy, Carson found Hope frustrating to work with. The core problem? Bob Hope was old school. He came prepared with written jokes, cue cards, and strict talking points. There was no room for spontaneity. Carson, on the other hand, thrived on the unknown. He liked seeing where a conversation might go. With Hope, everything felt scripted. It was like talking to a human press release, Carson quipped. Instead of sharing real moments, Hope treated the show like a billboard for his next special. Another issue was Hope's unwillingness to engage. While most guests brought something personal, whether it was a story, a laugh, or even vulnerability, Hope just stuck to the plan. His interviews were more like skits. Producers were even handed lists of approved jokes beforehand. Carson was reduced to playing the setup man for punchlines. There was no spark, no connection. Carson also resented that he didn't have much of a choice. Bob Hope was a Hollywood icon. Booking him wasn't optional, it was expected. But by the later years, Hope didn't have much to say. His visits felt more like advertisements than interviews. It stopped being fun, said one former staffer. Carson, who built his show on authenticity, couldn't hide his disinterest. While Carson could hide his discomfort behind a smile with Bob Hope, the fallout with the next guest cut much deeper. It wasn't just a mismatch in styles, it was a betrayal that shattered a long-standing friendship. What happens when someone you helped build a career turns around and blindsides you? That's exactly what happened with Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers. In the early days, Johnny Carson adored Joan Rivers. She was funny, fast, and fearless. "God, she's funny," Carson once said after one of her first appearances. He gave her a shot when almost no one else would, and in return, she lit up the stage. But that connection would come crashing down in a way no one saw coming. Joan wasn't just a guest, she was Carson's go-to guest host. In the early 80s, when Carson took time off, she was the one America saw behind his desk. Many thought she was being groomed to take over The Tonight Show. But in 1986, everything changed. Without warning, Joan accepted a late-night show on Fox. Carson didn't hear it from her. He heard it from the news. Carson felt betrayed. He believed in loyalty. He had opened doors for Joan Rivers, and in his eyes, she had slammed one shut without even a heads up. When she tried to call him afterward to explain, he refused to take the call. She never even said goodbye, Carson told a close friend. From that moment on, she was banned from The Tonight Show. Not just for a few years, for decades. Even after Carson retired, the grudge stuck. Jay Leno honored the ban. Joan Rivers didn't appear on the show again until 2014, long after Johnny had passed, and Jimmy Fallon had taken over. The rift became one of the most talked-about feuds in late-night history. "I lost my mentor, my friend," Rivers once said. It was a wound that never quite healed. With Joan Rivers, the hurt came from betrayal. But the next feud was built on something even stranger, jokes. Repeated, personal jabs that pushed one celebrity past his breaking point. And when he finally confronted Carson, it wasn't with words. It was with sheer presence. The fallout between Johnny Carson and Wayne Newton wasn't just awkward, it was intimidating. Wayne Newton. Johnny Carson loved a good joke, especially when it came with a little edge. But sometimes, the laughs didn't land. And with Wayne Newton, Carson's jokes did more than sting. They sparked a confrontation that left the legendary host visibly shaken. "He didn't think I'd ever confront him," Newton later said. But confront him, he did. Carson had made Newton a recurring punchline. The Vegas singer's flashy style, polished appearance, and high voice made him easy fodder. "Is he a singer or a hair? Commercial," Carson once joked. These weren't just one-liners. They were recurring gags. And while Newton tried to brush them off, the constant ridicule started to wear thin. Eventually, Newton had enough. He marched into Carson's office, face to face, no cameras, no audience, and gave him a warning. Some say it got physical. Others just remember how tense things became. "He got right in Carson's face," recalled one staff member. For a man who always controlled the room, Carson was suddenly cornered. He wasn't used to being the target. After that day, the jokes stopped. Carson, who rarely backed down, didn't cross Newton again. But the damage was done. Their relationship never recovered. Newton's appearances on the show became rare, and when they happened, they carried an awkward, uneasy vibe. "It was never the same," Newton admitted. Some feuds burn hot and fast, like Newton's explosive confrontation. Others are slow and quiet, a mismatch so complete that it leaves everyone feeling awkward. That's exactly what happened when Carson sat across from one of the kindest, most beloved men in children's television. But kindness doesn't always make for good TV. Enter Mr. Rogers. Fred Rogers was a symbol of kindness and compassion. For millions of Americans, he was the gentle voice who helped children understand their feelings. But when Mr. Rogers stepped onto The Tonight Show, something didn't click. Johnny Carson, the king of late-night banter, suddenly found himself in a conversation that didn't go anywhere. Carson built his reputation on sharp wit, light teasing, and lively conversations. But with Rogers, all of that was off the table. Fred didn't joke. He didn't banter. He spoke slowly, sincerely, and from the heart. "It felt like I was interviewing a priest," one staffer recalled. Carson couldn't find an opening. Not for jokes, not even for casual back and forth. It was as if he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. The tone was off from the start. Rogers talked about kindness and childhood education. Carson's audience, tuning in for laughs and celebrity gossip, found themselves in a quiet, philosophical moment. The usual rhythm of the show was gone, and for Carson, who was a perfectionist about timing and energy, it was unnerving. "He was too genuine," Carson reportedly told a producer. There was also the matter of chemistry, or the lack of it. Carson thrived when guests played along, when they let him steer the moment. But Rogers didn't play. He wasn't there to perform. He was there to share a message. And in doing so, he unknowingly created a wall between himself and the tone of the show. Carson respected Rogers, no doubt, but the truth was, he just didn't enjoy the interview. Fred Rogers may have made Carson feel stuck in an interview he couldn't navigate, but the next guest brought an entirely different kind of discomfort. He wasn't overly sincere. He was overly serious. Old Hollywood royalty with a thunderous presence and a reputation for taking himself very seriously. When Charlton Heston walked onto the set, things got heavy and fast. Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston wasn't just a movie star. He was a cinematic titan. With epic roles in Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments, Heston walked into any room like he was still on a soundstage. But while that worked in Hollywood, it didn't work on The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson couldn't quite crack the marble exterior. From the moment Heston sat down, the mood changed. He spoke in full paragraphs, long, detailed monologues about filmmaking, politics, and philosophy. While most guests played along with Carson's rhythm, Heston created his own tempo, and it was slow. It was like trying to surf with someone reading a textbook, Carson joked after one episode. He wanted laughs. Heston gave lectures. There was also a stiffness to Heston that made things awkward. He rarely joked. He didn't self-deprecate. In fact, he often corrected Carson on details or veered off into historical tangents. Carson, a master of flow and timing, found himself boxed in. He couldn't lead the dance because Heston wasn't dancing. Things got even more tense as Heston became more vocal politically. As a proud conservative and later president of the NRA, he sometimes brought that energy to his interviews. Carson wasn't a political host. He avoided hot-button topics. But Heston couldn't help himself. It made the conversations not just heavy, but risky. Despite all that, Carson always remained polite. He didn't dislike Heston personally, but the two just didn't click. The interviews felt more like panel discussions, and Carson, who loved sparring with quick, witty minds, found the exchanges exhausting. "He was serious," Carson once muttered backstage. "Maybe too serious for this show." While Heston's seriousness made Carson feel like he was interviewing a monument, the next guest did the opposite. He brought energy, music, and deep convictions to the set, but also a tendency to steer every conversation towards social justice. What happens when a guest turns a comedy show into a civil rights forum? That was the challenge with Harry Belafonte. Harry Belafonte wasn't just a performer, he was a movement. Known for his legendary music and passionate activism, Belafonte came on to The Tonight Show with more on his mind than entertainment. And while Johnny Carson respected his message, he often struggled to keep the tone of the show intact. When Belafonte sat down, he didn't stick to scripts or lighthearted promotion. He wanted to talk about racial inequality, global injustice, and the responsibilities of fame. Important topics, yes, but a stark contrast to the show's usual late-night rhythm. "It's tough to make jokes after someone brings up apartheid," one writer admitted. Carson was in a tough spot, too serious, and the mood tanked. Too jokey, and it seemed tone-deaf. Carson appreciated guests with range, but he also had a show to run. Belafonte's interviews would often pull focus away from entertainment and into real-world struggles. And while that made for powerful television at times, it also broke the format. Carson liked balance. Belafonte came in swinging, passionate and intense. It was difficult to bring the room back up afterward. Behind the scenes, there was also tension. Belafonte's schedule was tight, his demands specific. He was used to commanding rooms, not deferring to hosts. That kind of energy clashed with Carson's preference for easygoing, adaptable guests. It wasn't a power struggle, but it wasn't smooth either. Still, Carson never disrespected Belafonte. In fact, he admired his courage. But admiration didn't equal chemistry. "Some people come to entertain, some come to enlighten," Carson once said. Harry tried to do both, and that's not always easy at 11:30 at night. It was a relationship built on mutual respect, but not mutual rhythm. Harry Belafonte brought a message, but the next guest brought something else entirely. Ego. Young, rising fast, and radiating smugness, he was one of the few people who could make Carson visibly irritated on live TV. When Chevy Chase walked onto The Tonight Show, it wasn't just awkward, it was icy. Chevy Chase. When Chevy Chase first hit the scene, he was white-hot. Fresh off Saturday Night Live, he had become a breakout star. Charming, sarcastic, and a little too confident for his own good. But when he showed up on The Tonight Show, his attitude didn't win him any points with Johnny Carson. In fact, it did the opposite. From the moment Chase sat down, Carson could feel the tension. There was something in Chase's delivery, too dry, too smug, that made conversations feel more like battles of ego than moments of connection. He had a way of answering questions with a smirk, offering up sarcasm instead of sincerity. "It felt like he thought he was too cool to be there," said a former staffer. And Carson didn't appreciate that energy. Another issue? Chase didn't play along. Carson was a generous host. He loved letting guests shine, but he expected a bit of rhythm. Chase didn't follow the beat. He'd cut off punchlines, dodge setups, or steer conversations toward himself. While many comedians used The Tonight Show as a stage to earn laughs through humility, Chase used it to showcase attitude. Carson, who valued humility and flow, found that exhausting. There was also a hint of rivalry. Chase, still young in his career, was already being whispered about as a possible successor to Carson's late-night throne. Whether he said it or not, Carson could feel the ambition. He'd seen many comedians come and go, but Chase didn't just want airtime. He wanted to rule the night. And for a man who had spent decades building that legacy, Carson wasn't about to hand it over. In the end, their conversations were stiff, the chemistry forced. Carson gave Chase the space to win over the audience, but the connection was never there. "It just didn't feel good," Chase later admitted. "We didn't really vibe." And in Carson's world, that was enough to make someone an unwelcome guest. While Chase's smugness left Carson cold, the next guest brought a storm of tension with every entrance. He wasn't just a star, he was a legend. But legends come with ego, and Frank Sinatra's ego could fill a room before he even opened his mouth. Carson knew how to handle big names, but Sinatra was something else entirely. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was a living icon. His name alone could boost ratings. But behind the scenes, Johnny Carson didn't always enjoy having old blue eyes on his couch. Why? Because when Sinatra arrived, he didn't come alone. He brought chaos, control, and a sense that he was the real star of the show. Sinatra wasn't your average guest. He had a reputation for doing things his way, on stage and off. When he showed up on The Tonight Show, he often brought an entourage that took over backstage. The atmosphere shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't Carson's show anymore. It was Sinatra's appearance. "You could feel the air change when Frank walked in," a producer once said. Carson also valued structure. His monologue, the interviews, the timing, it was all part of a delicate balance. But Sinatra didn't care much for schedules. One infamous night, he walked on stage mid-monologue, interrupting Carson without warning. The audience laughed. Carson played it cool, but inside, he was furious. That kind of disruption wasn't just rude, it was a challenge to Carson's authority. And then there was the attitude. Sinatra didn't always respect the format. Sometimes he dodged questions. Other times, he dominated the conversation, veering off topic or ignoring Carson's lead entirely. While Carson admired Sinatra's talent, he didn't appreciate being upstaged on his own turf. Frank knew he was bigger than the show, one crew member said, and he acted like it. Still, Carson was a pro. He never let the tension show on camera. He smiled, played along, and gave Sinatra his moment. But behind the scenes, the dynamic was strained. Carson, who thrived on control, couldn't control Sinatra, and that made every appearance feel like walking a tightrope. One wrong step, and the whole show could wobble. While Sinatra brought old-school swagger, the next guest brought a tidal wave of emotion and bold presence. She could sing, she could act, and she could absolutely dominate a room. Bette Midler was unforgettable, and not always in ways Carson appreciated. Their chemistry lit up the screen. But backstage? It was a different story. Bette Midler. Bette Midler is a force of nature, wildly talented, brutally honest, and impossible to ignore. Her appearances on The Tonight Show were electric, filled with laughter, music, and even tears. But despite the unforgettable moments, Johnny Carson reportedly found Midler's presence both thrilling and unsettling. She wasn't just a guest, she was a spotlight stealer. On camera, they made magic. One of her most famous moments came during Carson's second-to-last show, where she serenaded him with "One for My Baby." Carson choked up, visibly emotional. "I'm gonna miss you," she whispered. It was beautiful television. But behind the scenes, things were less warm. Midler later said Carson was cold off camera, distant, even dismissive. He was never particularly kind to me, she admitted. Part of the tension came from personality differences. Carson was composed, almost reserved. He liked control and subtlety. Midler was the opposite, loud, expressive, unapologetically bold. Her energy sometimes overpowered Carson, shifting the spotlight in a way that made him feel like a guest on his own show. She was the only one who could outshine Johnny without trying, said one producer. There was also a gender dynamic at play. Midler was an assertive woman in a male-dominated space. Carson, raised in a more traditional era, may have felt off balance around her confidence. She didn't defer. She didn't play coy. She met him joke for joke, and sometimes pushed further. That kind of energy, while captivating, made Carson uncomfortable. Despite all that, Carson respected her talent. He knew her appearances made headlines, and he never let personal discomfort stand in the way of good TV. But it was clear that he preferred quieter guests, ones who followed his lead. With Midler, the spotlight was shared, sometimes unwillingly. And that tension, though never spoken out loud, was felt every time she walked onto the set. Bette Midler's fearless presence made Carson squirm, but the next guest pushed boundaries in a completely different way. He wasn't trying to steal the spotlight, he was trying to challenge the system. As comedy turned political in the 1970s, one man stood at the center of that shift. But his revolution didn't sit well with Carson, especially when it showed up on his stage. George Carlin. George Carlin started his career as a clean-cut comic in a suit and tie. Early on, Johnny Carson welcomed him like any other promising comedian. But as Carlin evolved, shedding the suit, growing out his hair, and sharpening his material, he drifted into territory that made Carson uneasy. And by the 1970s, their relationship had quietly cooled. Carson's show thrived on middle-of-the-road comedy, clever but safe. Carlin, by contrast, was becoming the voice of rebellion. He talked about the government, religion, censorship, and society's hypocrisy. His famous 7 dirty words routine didn't just push the envelope, it tore it open. "I didn't come here to make people comfortable," Carlin once said. That philosophy clashed with Carson's polished, late-night tone. The shift wasn't immediate. Carlin still appeared on the show in his early transition years, but something had changed. Carson liked guests who stayed within his boundaries. Witty, yes, but not provocative. Carlin was no longer playing by those rules. He wanted to say something, and Johnny just wanted to entertain, said a longtime writer. Their comedic missions were no longer aligned. Privately, Carson wasn't angry. He was careful. He didn't like unpredictability on his show, especially the kind that could get letters from censors or alienate advertisers. Carlin was brilliant, no doubt, but also a liability. Slowly, Carlin stopped being invited back. He became more of a legend outside The Tonight Show than on it. Carson admired his genius from a distance. While Carlin challenged the system with language and ideas, the next guest simply challenged Carson's patience. She wasn't political, and she wasn't countercultural. She was just unpredictable. Loud, opinionated, and often off-script, Shelley Winters didn't fit into any late-night mold. And for a host who prized smooth interviews, that made her one of his most chaotic guests. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters wasn't just an actress. She was a walking whirlwind. Oscar-winning, outspoken, and unfiltered, she brought fire to every room she entered. But when she sat opposite Johnny Carson, that fire didn't always lead to laughs. Sometimes, it just left him burned out. From the moment she walked onto the stage, Winters was unpredictable. She'd veer off topic, interrupt Carson, and launch into stories that felt like side quests with no end in sight. One night, she even handed him her shoe in the middle of an interview. Carson, who liked tight, clean segments, was visibly irritated. It was like trying to steer a rocket without controls. said one crew member. Winters didn't respect the usual guest etiquette. She talked over Carson, challenged his questions, and often ignored the comedic setups entirely. Carson valued rhythm and give and take. With Winters, it was all take. Her brash style didn't leave room for subtlety, and that made the interview feel more like a struggle than a segment. There was also a personality clash. Carson was cool, calculated, and private. Winters was loud, impulsive, and always on. The energy mismatch was glaring. She needed a sparring partner, and Carson wasn't interested in sparring, especially not live, in front of millions. She was exhausting, admitted a former Tonight Show staffer. Not because she was bad, just because she never stopped. Still, Winters made for compelling television. Audiences watched, unsure of what would happen next. But for Carson, who built his show on grace and control, Shelley Winters was the kind of guest who made him count the minutes until the next commercial break. From chaos to competition, our next guest wasn't an actress or a comedian, but a fellow broadcaster. And not just any broadcaster. Tom Snyder was known for his intensity, his ego, and his love of hearing himself talk. When he crossed into Carson's domain, it wasn't a friendly visit, it was a late-night turf war. Tom Snyder. Tom Snyder was a late-night staple in his own right, known for deep, dramatic interviews and his booming voice. But when he sat across from Johnny Carson, he didn't act like a guest. He acted like a rival. And that energy turned what should have been a friendly visit into a cold war of personalities. Carson's interviews were about flow and balance. Snyder, however, dominated the conversation. He spoke at length, often without pause, and barely let Carson steer the direction. He talked like he was still in his own studio, one segment producer said. That annoyed Carson, who was used to guests knowing their role: entertain, don't overtake. There was also professional tension. Snyder's show, Tomorrow, aired right after The Tonight Show. Technically, they weren't competing, but in the TV world, visibility is power. Snyder's bold style, unpredictable interviews, and brash opinions made him a standout. Carson noticed, and while he never said it publicly, sources close to the show said Johnny didn't love the spotlight being shared. Off-camera, Snyder was opinionated and intense. He was known to push topics into awkward zones, something Carson avoided like the plague. Politics, scandals, media drama, Snyder went there. Carson didn't, and having Snyder on meant bracing for potential derailment. The interviews weren't comfortable. They were tug-of-wars. Carson never banned Snyder. He kept things professional. But when Tom was on, you could sense the strain. The laughs were fewer, the transitions were harder, and Carson's usually easy smile didn't come as freely. It was one of the rare cases where two men used to being in control were forced to share space, and neither liked it. If Tom Snyder was all ego and intensity, our final guest was pure flash. She came with diamonds, stories, and a Hungarian accent that could melt or freeze a room. Zsa Zsa Gabor was Hollywood royalty, but when she sat across from Johnny Carson, all the glitz in the world couldn't hide their lack of chemistry. Zsa Zsa Gabor was the definition of flamboyant. Glamorous, witty, and endlessly quotable, she lived for the spotlight. But on The Tonight Show, all that sparkle didn't lead to substance. For Johnny Carson, hosting Gabor wasn't just exhausting. It was like chasing a butterfly in a hurricane. From the start, Gabor dominated the conversation. She loved to talk about herself, her husbands, her diamonds. There was rarely a moment of give and take. Carson would ask a question, and Gabor would launch into a monologue, often ignoring the question entirely. She answered the question she wanted to hear, one writer joked. Carson liked guests who played along, laughed at themselves, and left space for him to steer. But Zsa Zsa didn't share the stage. She performed, and if you tried to cut in, she'd just keep going. That made interviews feel like runaway trains, careening off track with no brakes. There was also a certain insincerity that bothered Carson. He was sharp enough to spot when someone was putting on a character, and Gabor was always playing a role. The accent, the attitude, the endless flirtation, it all felt rehearsed. She wasn't real, Carson once said privately. She was a brand. And finally, her lack of self-awareness killed the humor. Carson could make a great interview out of anyone willing to laugh at themselves, but Zaja rarely took the joke. When Carson teased her, she bristled. When he tried to pivot, she talked over him. The sparkle dimmed quickly, and all that remained was discomfort. Johnny Carson spent 30 years as the undisputed king of late-night television. He smiled through awkward moments, sparred with egos, and held his show together with charm and wit. But even the greatest host had limits. These weren't just difficult interviews. They were the rare moments when Carson's patience wore thin, and the cracks in the smoothest show on TV quietly showed. Johnny Carson made it look effortless, but even legends have their limits. These uncomfortable interviews and off-camera tensions reveal a side of Carson that few ever saw. It wasn't about drama for drama's sake. It was about chemistry, respect, and the delicate art of conversation. When that broke down, so did the charm. These guests weren't just disliked. They disrupted the very flow that made The Tonight Show iconic. If anything, this list proves one thing. Even the most beloved entertainers have moments they'd rather forget, and guests they wish had never shown up. Late night had rules, and Carson never forgot who broke them.